Okay, I am back. I'm actually doing these back to back. If it looks like I have on my same clothes, I'm just doing them back to back, recording them back to back, and then I'll post them 2 days in a row. All right, so we want to, this is Jen Fishburne. Welcome to my show, Preterism Changes Everything. And we want to pick up where we left off with, we were discussing the natural consequences of the curse, the threefold curse that was given to the serpent. The natural serpent who would crawl on his belly, eat dust, and be enemies with women. All right, that's basically what it was going on right here. Now, we do see a deeper sense of this curse as well. So we're going to start with Micah 7 verses 16 to 17 first. The nations shall see and be ashamed of all their might. They shall lay their hands on their mouths. Their ears shall be deaf. They shall lick the dust like a serpent, like the crawling things of the earth. They shall come trembling out of their strongholds. They shall turn in dread to the Lord our God, and they shall be in fear of you. So this is a good picture here of how the natural of the serpent also points to other things that are happening in this metaphor is with the nations and how they are in relation to Jehovah. So when we see a serpent writhing on the ground, licking the dust, it should remind us of how a God used a serpent to first deceive Eve, and that we should be much wiser in dealing with those who wish to deceive us, right? Lest we are really listening to a being who is crawling on the ground and eating dust. Then we're going to see a shift in this curse. First, Jehovah is speaking specifically of how he is dealing with Eve and the serpent, and they are going to be enemies. But then he adds in Eve's descendants, which we now know is Jesus, right? Or is it? In the Hebrew, when it says between your seed and her seed, the word for seed can be either singular or plural. This is where we find our first case of individual versus corporate. All right. Now, the grammar there in the Hebrew could literally be either one. So we know that when we use the word you in English, it can be you, just the one person I'm speaking to, or it could be you, everyone that I'm speaking to. So that's what's going on here in the word in the Hebrew as well, and we cannot tell from the way that word is whether it was speaking of something individual or corporate. But let's take a look at some more information and see if we can find out. It could be talking about one of Eve's descendants, whom we all know as Jesus, or it could be talking about a group of Eve's descendants. Who would that be? Israel, right? It could be talking about one of the serpent god's descendants, or it could be talking about a group of the serpent god's descendants grammatically. So which is it? To complicate it even further, before we look at that, the Latin says, she will crush your head and you will crush her heel. Well, this matches up more closely with Eve being a woman, right? But who is she, the she that will crush his head? Before we go there, let's finish this curse against the serpent. These descendants, whoever they are, will not utterly destroy one another, but there is going to be some serious wounding going on here. So who is this curse about? Is this the first gospel message? The first prophecy about Jesus? Who is the serpent's descendant? Let's look at all these possibilities, all right? So the first one we're going to look at is the most common, the one that has been passed down to us for 2,000 years. Satan and Jesus, right? Satan is the serpent, and he will bruise Jesus' heel by somehow being responsible for Jesus' death on the cross. But then Jesus will crush Satan's head later after he comes back to life. Well, there may be some validity to this view. How did Satan put Jesus on the cross? And is there a spiritual being even named Satan anyway? Or is that just the Hebrew word in some passages that means adversary, and we have somehow turned it into some invisible enemy's name? Furthermore, this curse says it would apply to both the descendants of Eve and the descendants of the serpent, not to the serpent itself. So, could Jesus be the one descendant of Eve in this curse? Absolutely. That's very, very possible. We know that the seed line from the first Adam to the last Adam, which was Jesus, had to be kept pure all the way down, and that there was a constant battle to interrupt that genealogical line. So if this curse was about Jesus' feet being nailed to the cross, who was it who did that? Well, the Roman soldiers, right? But they were just obeying orders, right? So who really orchestrated the murder of Jesus? Well, Judas, then the Sanhedrin, Annas, Caiaphas, Pontius Pilate, to the Roman soldiers. So let's take a look here at the Sanhedrin. Who were the Sanhedrin? The Sanhedrin is the Jewish Supreme Court of Jerusalem. They were probably the Great Sanhedrin, which was 71 judges who ruled together as an assembly or a council. They were the ones that ruled in Jerusalem. This is what grew out of the body of ruling elders that Moses established many years earlier with the help of his father-in-law, right? The Talmud tells us that the Sanhedrin was to be made up of former high priests, representatives of the 24 priestly castes. Remember that the priests were divided into 24 groups, and they were to take turns serving during that time. And so those 24 groups, they would have a representative from each of those 24 groups were in the Sanhedrin as well. Doctors of the law and representatives of the most prominent families. And those families were those that the daughters were allowed to marry priests. So Mark and Luke both say that the Sanhedrin was made up of the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. Well, John says it was the chief priests and the Pharisees. The scholars are split almost even on whether it was made up of Sadducees, Pharisees, or both. The Sanhedrin had various functions, but judicially, it could try a high priest, a false prophet, a rebellious elder, or an errant tribe. However, it is really unknown if they actually had the authority to condemn Jesus to death and to even try Jesus for what he was doing. So this great Sanhedrin council ceased to exist after AD 70. They just kind of petered out. The Sanhedrin council that met for Jesus' trial was probably just an ad hoc group, whoever happened to be there at the time. It wasn't an official court that was called into session. They had not had this official, Jesus didn't have the time to show up at court, at 9 a.m. and sit through the docket and all of that kind of stuff. It was just like they wanted it done. They wanted it done now. So whoever of those 71 Supreme Court justices, if you will, were around at the time, those were the ones who were gathered together for this. Now, this was the Supreme Court of Jerusalem, and this was a pretty major deal. So it could be that the majority of them were there for this. All right, but we don't know. We do not know. It was not an official court proceeding, though. There was nothing official, nothing right done about it at all. So whoever they were specifically, we do know that the Jewish religious leaders as a corporate group were the ones who found Jesus guilty and sent him ultimately to Pontius Pilate for sentencing, right? Now, why did I go into all of that? Well, because I think Jesus tells us clearly who the serpent's descendants were. So let's look at a few passages. Matthew 3:7. But when Jesus saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to his baptism, he said to them, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come?" In Matthew, so let's go ahead and do this here. Brood of vipers. So the word for brood there means offspring. And vipers, I think everyone knows, is serpents. So it just means baby serpents. You baby serpents. All right, why would Jesus call the Sadducees and the Pharisees at his baptism This is before that they've had any interaction. This is their first interaction whatsoever. And the first thing he does is call them a baby serpents. Okay, so there's definitely something going on here, right? Let's see what else he does here. In Matthew 12, Jesus says, it's interesting how he starts here. Listen to this connection, all right? Either make the tree good and its fruit good, or make the tree bad and its fruit bad, for the tree is known by its fruit. Is that a connection all the way back to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the fruit that was eaten from it? I think it is. I really think it is. You brood of vipers. Again, here he is talking to them. You baby snakes, you baby serpents, how can you speak good when you are evil? For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. The good person out of his good treasure brings forth good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure brings forth evil. I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will give account for every careless word they speak. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. So this is really Jesus this is Jesus being the last Adam. This is a perfect picture of Jesus being the last Adam. He's going back to that tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden, and he is talking to them. They are the snake. They are the serpent. And he is turning this around on them and telling them really what the meaning of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is when it comes full circle. So there can be a natural meaning to it, and there was, but there could also be a spiritual meaning to it. And that is where the natural always points to the spiritual. That's two sides of one coin, right? And that's what we're seeing here. Jesus is explaining, which is what Jesus mostly does, is he explains the spiritual side of the natural that they've already experienced in the Old Testament. All right, we're going to see that a lot. All right, so baby snakes, that's what he's calling them, you baby snakes. Why would he call them that? All right, the third passage that we see is in Matthew 23. And there are 7 woes that are pronounced against the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, I'm not going to read the whole passage. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to skip down and read the 7 woes. I'm going to skip through it and read real briefly what the 7 woes are, and see how that applies to what we're talking about here. All right. So Jesus starts out by saying the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you. In other words, the scribes and the Pharisees teach them what Moses has been saying in the Torah all the time. So obey it. That's what he's saying. But not the works they do, for they preach but do not practice. But woe to you, first woe, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut the kingdom of earth in people's faces. Woe to you, second woe, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across the sea and land to make a single proselyte. Woe to you, third one, blind guides, who say, if anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing, but if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin and have neglected the weightier matters of the law. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. Number 7, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous. You are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. And then he ends with this. After 7 woes, he ends with this. You serpents, you brood of vipers, who are you? How are you to escape being sentenced to hell? For on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Who's he speaking to? The scribes and the Pharisees who were standing there that day. All these things that they were talking about that would happen at the end are going to happen to those scribes and those Pharisees. They were the ones who were going to have those 7 woes come upon them. They were the baby serpents. They were the ones that were the descendants of that serpent in the garden. Clear as clear can be. They were the ones. So, Jesus clearly tells us who this curse against the serpent's offspring was directed to and fulfilled by. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes of Jesus' generation. Indeed, all the Jewish religious leaders, including the high priests of Jesus' day. This brood of vipers, the serpent's offspring, were the corporate group that bruised Jesus' heel by crucifixion. It was not some invisible Satan. Now, how about, let's see here. How much do I have here? All right, got a little bit less left here I can finish up today. All right, now how about the rest of it? Did Jesus crush this brood of vipers' head? So around 56 AD, the Apostle Paul wrote in Romans 16:20, "The God of peace will soon crush Satan," or the adversary, "under your feet." Again, Satan there should be adversary, so it should just be read that the God of peace will soon crush the adversary under your feet, right? That sounds like the fulfillment of the curse of Genesis 3:15, doesn't it? And do those Jewish religious leaders still rule today? No. In AD 70, at the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the power and authority of the Jewish religious system was pretty much brought to nothing, although it wasn't completely destroyed. And that is exactly what the curse says. That was about 15 years after Paul wrote that short sentence. So I'm going to start by saying that the first layer of this passage in Genesis 3:15 was about the conflict and the war between the Jewish religious leaders, the corporate group here, and Jesus in the first century. But could it be more? Was it just Jesus that brought the Jewish religious leaders' power and authority to no effect? Or did the apostles greatly contribute to that? And the rest of the first century church, as they moved away from the law of Moses to the law written on their heart in the new covenant? Yes, the church of the first century was definitely the fulfillment of Eve's offspring in so many ways as well. This was the corporate nature of the offspring of Eve. The church ended up defeating the Jewish religious rulers by teaching truth and living truth. That's what Jesus was ranting and raving against with those Pharisees and the Sadducees who were such hypocrites, right? In the 7 woes. The truth will always defeat hypocrisy in the end. So Jesus was both the Messiah of the church of the first century, as well as the bridegroom of the corporate bride of the first century church. Jesus was both the individual fulfillment of the curse against the serpent and the head of the corporate fulfillment of the curse of the serpent. Now, was there an individual offspring of the serpent? I don't think we can clearly point to one. Perhaps the same God that inhabited the serpent in Genesis 3 also inhabited the Jewish religious leaders of the first century, but I think we would be hard-pressed to prove that. So if you have an idea on that one, let me know. All right? Now, last one here. What about the serpent's seed doctrine? Have you heard of the serpent's seed doctrine? I'm not going to teach that whole doctrine here. But if you are interested in doing your own study of Cain and Abel having 2 different fathers, and that the curse is actually about how the descendants of Cain would always be enemies with the descendants of Seth, who took Abel's place when he was killed, then I will give you a place to look into that. I'll post that in the comments there. I personally see tons of evidence for it, but I could also see that it could just be someone's wild imagination as well. So I'm not going to take a position on it either way. But I do have to wonder why eating a piece of fruit off the tree was so evil. And on the other hand, committing adultery would make much more sense of this entire story. So if you want to find out about why the eating the forbidden fruit actually had to do with sex and adultery and homosexuality and Cain and Abel having 2 different fathers, then I'll leave a link for you to look that up, but I'm not going to be teaching on that at length. I wanted to just mention it because It is definitely one of the, I don't want to say major interpretations of this, but it's becoming more and more and more well known. I think it's worth looking into. Could it be both? I think so. I mean, I think that there are layers to the stories in Scripture, and so there's no reason why, I don't think why it couldn't be both. To me, it makes much more sense that the story was about sex, and that is the common theme that we see all throughout the Bible. We don't see a common theme about eating a piece of fruit all throughout the Bible. So whichever it is, you can decide on that one. But I do see layers all throughout Scripture, so you'll see me talking about more than one answer for different scenarios. So that's what we've got today, and tomorrow we'll pick up with the curse against the woman. Hope you guys have a great day. Talk to you later. Bye.